Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Brian Bonner, Chief Editor of the Kyiv Post, coming to you live at 4 p.m. Kyiv time from the Kyiv Post studio in the Kdor building of 68 Zhelanska Street. We have a great and a very timely discussion today. NATO and Ukraine, the way forward. It's been a long way for NATO and Ukraine, but there is a way forward, and we have some of the best speakers we could find today on the subject. I want to first of all thank the NATO Information and Documentation Center for making this gathering possible. And before we get into the discussion, I want to turn the floor over to Benita Klein, Director of NATO Information and Documentation Center, who's had a long relationship, more than 20 years, 25 years almost, in Ukraine. So Benita, the floor is yours.
Brian, thank you for inviting and thank you for hosting us tonight, this afternoon, and I'm indeed thankful for our joint event, during which we will discuss NATO-Ukraine relationship, the reform process of Ukraine, and reforms that are ongoing in the sector of defense and security. And indeed, the Ukrainian people have made their choice clear. It's on Maidan Square, during elections, and by taking active participation in civil society organizations, that Ukrainians, they want to be part of a family where to which belong free and democratic nations. And today we will be discussing the reform process in the security and defense sector and what can be done and what should be done to bring these reforms forward. However, I would like to underline that equally important is also democratic oversight, democratic governance of defense and security sector. And equally important are reforms of the judiciary. And also through the annual national program of Ukraine's annual national program, allies take an interest into into the reforms of the judiciary, into how functions the and what is the role of the Supreme Court, and also the effectiveness of the established and functioning anti-corruption establishments. And maybe before we go further, I would like to underline that there are still several, if you allow me, there are still several areas where Ukraine should go forward. And maybe just I will mention some of them. For example, the current system of oversight and civilian control and democratic oversight of the security and defense system needs to be modified in order to align with NATO principles and standards. Another thing where Ukraine should go forward is prioritization and clear articulation of strategic goals across the defense sector. One more thing is that improvement of the national planning architecture should be also taken forward. And here it's very important, this alignment between plans, between policy plans, resources and implementation. And also leadership should empower, should support and supply those who are charged with reforms. So these are areas we encourage Ukraine to go forward.
Okay. Benita, that's a really, really good summary and the way to set the table for our discussion today. And I want to add that this discussion is available on Kyiv Post website, Kyiv Post Facebook page, Twitter account, and will be kept forever on our Kyiv Post YouTube site. And also I want to mention that with the Information and Documentation Center, the Kyiv Post will be doing 2 more webinars this year. One is on Ukrainian soldiers' participation in NATO peacekeeping operations abroad, and very interesting stories to tell there. And the other is on Black Sea security. So that'll be coming up later. But now I want to turn to, we have two guests who are working remotely. I'll start by introducing Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO and former special representative to Ukraine, many other titles, of course, and he's also known for he's backing and pushing this creation of an American university on one of the most beautiful sites in Kyiv, near the river Vokzal, the river station. So, Kurt, I just wanted to say, I mean, the 2008 Bucharest Declaration stated that Ukraine will be eventually be a member of NATO. And then last night I read that 2030 NATO goals for 9 years from now, and said the goal is bringing Ukraine, NATO partner Ukraine, closer to the alliance. So that's 22 years. It's a long journey. Is there anything NATO can do to, Ukraine can do and NATO together to shorten that journey?
Yes, thank you, Brian. Thanks for inviting me, and to add a couple of things up front and to answer your question. First, in addition to the two roles that you mentioned, ambassador to NATO and special representative for Ukraine negotiations, most of my career was actually focused on NATO issues and NATO enlargement, including serving in Budapest in the mid-90s and doing the groundwork for the Prague summit in 2002, which invited 7 more countries to join NATO. So it has been a long-term commitment of mine to try to make sure that all of the people who have now emerged from behind the Soviet Union or the Iron Curtain, if they seek to be in democratic, market economic, and secure societies and part of the transatlantic community, that they can achieve those goals and to help them as much as possible. Second, I just want to pay a compliment to the Ukrainian armed forces and especially the special forces for their extraordinary role in helping to extract people from Afghanistan. I think that overall this was a tragedy that could have been avoided. I think the United States could have done a far better job here, but Ukraine stepped in and helped a number of people out, and I think that is really to be commended. Concerning your question, Brian, look, there are a lot of reforms and a lot of criteria that countries need to meet in order to qualify for NATO membership. Every country that has joined has had to go through a rigorous process of doing that. Ukraine has done a lot, it needs to do more, but that's not really the point. Of course, all these things need to be done and can be done. And it would take some effort on Ukraine's part with support from NATO. But the real issue here is political. It is the case where NATO makes decisions by consensus. That is to say, all of the member states need to agree in order to take a decision. And that means that for Ukraine to be invited to become a member of NATO right now, that would require all of the states to agree that that's what they want to do. And we know that that is not true. We know there are a number of states, European countries, I won't name names, but who worry that this would be provocative for Russia. They worry that it could be taking into the alliance an ongoing conflict, such as we have in Donbass. They worry that Ukraine, is not sufficiently reformed. There's too much corruption. That it would be damaging to NATO to bring Ukraine in. So we have a problem within NATO in reaching consensus to invite Ukraine. I happen to believe that Ukraine becoming a member of NATO is a matter of strategic importance for the security of Europe as a whole. For Ukraine, of course, but also for Europe, and also for the United States. And I think if Ukraine makes it as a democracy, a rule of law country, a member of NATO, it will be transformative for security in Europe as a whole. Ultimately, it will show a pathway how Russia can be a successful democracy, market economy, and secure country as well. And so I think it's critically important. But we have a lot of work to do. Ukraine to continue its drive towards better performance, but NATO to talk about the real strategic stakes here. As to how to accelerate the timeline, that was your question, Brian, I think it requires leadership from the United States. I think it's going to take the US beginning a dialogue with Ukraine, with Germany, with France, with the UK, with all the members of NATO to talk about what it will actually take, what actually has to happen. Right now, we are giving Ukraine a process answer. We're saying that the next step is the membership action plan, and no, you can't have it. And I think that is rather unfair to Ukraine and really not a very strategic answer. So I think we need to stop talking about the membership action plan and start talking about the real world. What will it actually take? What does Ukraine need to do to be convincing? What do we need to do within NATO? How do we deal with the shadow that Russia is casting over the region, including, as it was recently expressed by President Putin in his 5,000-word article that appeared about a month ago. So I'll pause there. I know you need to bring in other guests, but I just wanted to lay out that framework.
Thanks a lot, Ambassador Volker. I wanted to just follow up. I mean, since you were, the NATO summary fact sheet assesses its criteria for membership, and you were involved, and they've got a longer version on the website. It is subjective. You can read it one way and say Ukraine is doing pretty good. You can read it another way and say it's not quite there yet. How do you assess their meeting of the criteria?
Well, it is ultimately subjective because it's ultimately the decision of sovereign member states. What do they think? Do they think Ukraine is ready or not? And they will bring in other factors into their thinking, whether or not they are written down as those criteria. So, what our head of NATO Information Office said earlier is all true. And these are all specific things that NATO as an alliance and NATO members will want Ukraine to do. But in the end of the day, it's a political judgment exercised at the highest levels in each of the member states as to whether Ukraine has done enough and as to whether the political conditions in Europe and for the alliance as a whole make sense. And I think that's where we actually have the bigger problem. Ukraine, with help and with focus, could do the things that it needs to do, but doing that will not create an automaticity to an invitation. It's still going to require a political decision by the alliance.
And finally, President Zelensky said recently NATO would be stronger with Ukraine in it, and the EU too. Do you agree?
I do agree with that. I think that we have to take seriously the fact that Russia is determined to attack Ukraine, occupy its territory, occupy part of Georgia. Russia is doing everything it can to prevent Ukraine from achieving that, including using military force and violence. So we have to be realistic that NATO taking the step to bring Ukraine in could actually create some escalation of the conflict. We have to be clear-eyed about that. But Ukraine has a vast geographic territory. It has one of the most combat-hardened armed forces in Europe now, after having been rebuilt from 2015. And it has shown that it is willing to contribute to NATO operations elsewhere, such as in Afghanistan. So I think Ukraine brings a lot to the table, more than is often recognized in Brussels.
Okay, thanks, Kurt. I think now is a good time to bring in Glenn Grant. Glenn has served 37 years in the British Army. He is, I believe, coming to us from Riga today. He's with the Baltic Security Foundation, and he is an expert in Ukrainian defense reforms. And Glenn is the author of a very long and very blistering op-ed published last July by the Jamestown Foundation about the areas where Ukraine needs to improve its reform progress. Glenn, I want to, the headline about said it all, the reforms going nowhere. Basically, you said it's a lot of lip service with a Soviet still mindset and operations in the defense sector in Ukraine, lack of transparency, on and on and on. Can you talk about what led you to those conclusions, and do they hold up today?
Yes, thank you. And I'll say first of all that I agree with everything that Vineta said at the beginning, and pretty much everything that Kurt said. Pretty much. I think that this is a multi-level problem, and it's a multi-level problem for NATO. I think that I would say that the biggest challenge is language, in that NATO talks one language and the senior Ukrainian people talk another language in the military and in the defence system, and you can probably add to that the National Guard, the prison service, the judges. So they're still talking and still living to a large degree the post-communist way of thinking, and this is a problem in many ways, because you have to remember that something like the Ministry of Defence that Andrew had the joy of managing for far too short a time was never designed as a Ministry of Defence. And it still isn't a Ministry of Defence. It was put together when the country gained independence, and it's never actually been a management system. It has no proper policy director, for example. So all decisions are decisions made on the day, so a large amount of the things that are failures in reform are simply failures in management, either because people don't know how to do it, or in many cases, they simply don't understand what we're talking about. Or there are contradictory thinking. For example, the comment about civil control over the military, whereas to a large amount of the population, if you haven't got a general in charge of the Ministry of Defence, you're failing, because they think that you have to have a general. And so automatically, when you're talking about having a civilian in charge of the Ministry of Defence, people think you're weakening it, and you're going to spoil it, and you're going to ruin it. So there's these language things and these conceptual things cause problems at the top. And when we say, well, NATO with NATO support, well, then you've got a problem, because if the person at the top, the leadership, and I would say that Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky, doesn't understand NATO by his utterings in the last month or so. If he doesn't understand what we're talking about, and he is the boss, then it's extremely difficult to get anything done below him, because this is a political task that he has to tell people to do. And if he doesn't understand what it is, or he thinks, as I think in many cases, that it is already okay, and when you say for something like, this battle-hardened army, it's missing a point that lots of those battle-hardened officers and soldiers have left and are leaving, and it's battle-hardened in a frontline ditch trench warfare system, but it's not battle-hardened in mobile warfare, and it's not doing anything at all like the training that Russia is conducting at the moment. So you've got these conceptual differences. I'll stop there, because I think Andrew will want to add or contradict me in things.
I'm sure Andrew will. One follow-up, if I might.
Yeah.
Let's leave aside the political mountain that has to be climbed and the membership question. Are there quick fixes that can be done that would strengthen Ukraine's armed forces and its ability to defend against Russian aggression? Or are you talking about, things that are going to take a very long time?
You can move things in many areas. You could move things quite quickly, but to do so, you have to follow the rules of reform, which is that people have got to be on the same side of the table. And at the moment, we're only on the same side of the table tactically. We're not on the same side of the table for example, in the Army headquarters, in the General Staff, or in the Ministry of Defence. When you look at, you can see when anything happens there, it's people sitting in two parallel lines, one on one table, one on the other table, facing each other. And you will never, ever, ever get reform in that manner. You have to sit in someone's office, and you have to work with him on his task, because that's what he wants to do. He doesn't want to hear about, gender politics. He doesn't want to hear about something else, somewhere else, what NATO, the nice things of NATO. He wants you to help him fix his job. But if we're not allowed in to help him fix his job, the reform will not happen, because you can't do reform at arm's length. You can't help at arm's length, I should say. You can only help sitting next to someone. So that is a NATO problem. NATO has got to, if it wants to help with reform, it's got to try and change the paradigm of how we do reform. Because at the moment, just bringing in more people who've got lots of good ideas is not going to make any difference whatsoever. You only have to read Tom Young's book to see that for, for years, 20 odd years, America has spent billions of pounds on reform for very little change across the whole of Eastern Europe, the whole of the post-Soviet system. And Ukraine is the most complex, not by a long way, by a chunk ahead of Bulgaria, but it is extremely complex culturally inside the system. So I go back to it, language and explaining and understanding what to people. But it won't work if we only do it at the tactical level. We have to get in higher to the decision makers, to the policy makers, and actually change things at that level.
Okay, Glenn.
Does that make sense?
It's great. It does make sense. And now is a good time to bring in Andrei Zagorodnik,
Thank you.
who was a decision maker and a policy maker for Ukraine, one of the youngest, if not the youngest, defense ministers.
The youngest.
The youngest. And
The youngest, yeah.
and also now directs the Center for Defense Strategies, which is one
Yes.
of our newer think tanks. Your assessment of what you've heard?
Are you ready? Are you sure
I'm
Are you sure you
ready.
want to hear all that?
Indeed.
Let me break it into parts. First of all, I mean, thank you for inviting. It's a great question, obviously, about NATO, especially after all this, after NATO summit, after visit of President to Biden and so on. So let me kind of, if you don't mind, make a one step back and just to spend a minute
Please do.
on actually saying what would it take to reach NATO membership, hopefully, and all that sort of stuff. So it is working on many levels, and it's we're talking about interoperability with NATO forces. We're talking about political commitments. We're talking about diplomacy work with NATO and with NATO headquarters and with NATO representative offices. We're talking about the country larger reforms apart from interoperability, which is a military sub area. It's like on a political level, passing necessary laws, fighting corruption, and all those things. And only by having a progress on all these levels, we can talk about something more specific than some promises. Now, regarding the do we have a progress? I do believe we have a progress specifically after the summit, because the communique with summit, the wording which I've read, and we read it many times, seems like it's a step, it's one more step. Because on my personal experience, I spoke to a few leaders of the states and a few leaders of the ministries of defense, and some countries, NATO members, were not seeing Ukraine a couple of years ago, even a year ago, at all among the members. They just haven't seen them. The fact that they issued the communique and signed all of them, where clearly they said that they do see now Ukraine, without any timeline, but still, at some point there was like no vision of Ukraine being member of NATO, full stop. And that's what we had to deal with. And when we were getting EOP, which is Enhanced Opportunity Partner Program, it's like almost like closest as you can get to be apart from being a member, full member. In some countries, we have to convince even that, because they were like concerned. So, question: what are the concerns? Some concerns, I have to tell you, and I'm not going to name as since Kurt added that sort of a tradition of not saying which country specifically. Some countries were saying, well, honestly, they're still struggling of understanding that Ukraine is a sovereign state. To be honest, I mean, this is a problem which we had to deal in some cases. And it was kind of a weird, because it's like 30 years after it became a sovereign state, and after like several years of war, of defending its status, but still they kind of in their mindset that we still had to deal with this thing. Some countries were clearly, but this is a pure, definitely a minority, so it's just one or two. Some countries where we had to work with, where they were afraid of being too much involved in our problem when we become a member of NATO. So they were saying, why the war with Russia should be now our problem if it's yours, which is a profound misunderstanding of what the war with Russia is. And again, that didn't mean that we now had to say, okay, your soldiers are going to fight in Donbass right now. We weren't saying that, and I don't think that would be even sensible to say in any way. But some of them were like thinking about this, that now they have to spend a larger part of their budget in order to fight Russia. Now, some countries clearly didn't want to fight Russia, generally speaking, anywhere. They were thinking this is not their problem, this is problem in some other states. Why should be ours? And they were scared even of thought. And I guess some Russian work was done in order for them to get that fear, you know. But nevertheless, they were like saying, no, we don't want to fight with Russia. We just generally West, as collective West, should not fight with Russia, because nobody politically is going to be tolerating those losses or whatever, but spendings and so on. We're not going to win anyway. Why we should? Which is the question then? What is the victory definition? Because it's not like destroying Kremlin and and blowing up Lenin Mausoleum or something like that for them. It may be just making sure that they move back to their historical borders, and number of other consequences. But so they were picturing themselves various, and I'm talking about people on Ministry of Defense level. I'm not talking about taxi drivers or some people who I met on the street. I'm talking about like a professional guys. So there's a certain work needs to be done to understand what actually is the nature of the conflict and what actually Russian strategy is. Because Russia's strategy is not Donbass, and it's not Crimea, and it's even not Ukraine. Russia's strategy is moving as long as it can, taking Belarus, then it would be Transnistria, then it would be something else, and then destroying U.S. elections, destroying some European elections, meddling with the politics and so on. So it's actually a far-reaching plan rather than just Donbass. And sadly, it's still a matter of debate in many cases. So anyway, so yes, that political part is obviously a challenge. Regarding the internal challenges, do we have them? Absolutely. Am I a huge fan of some people in Ministry of Defense? No, I'm not. Am I a big fan of some people in the head, especially former head of the of military? No, I'm not. But I cannot more profoundly disagree with Glenn written in his article, because the one thing is criticizing, and I know with all due respect, Glenn knows me since 2015. We met many times, with friends, and so on and so on. But the truth is more important. So the thing is that one thing is to criticize certain shortcomings, and I absolutely agree there are. Second thing is to reach the level when you see that pretty much everything is wrong and the army is incapable, and it's a Soviet and red communist sort of mentality is there, and so on and so on. So I actually read that article like several times, and I have to say that we are preparing a very, very grounded reply with the volunteers involved, with some military guys, especially ex-military guys. We're not involving current military because obviously they would be defending, their sort of like organization, whatever they did. Because there's a lot of facts there which are, I believe, something which is not very close to reality, sadly. And maybe some of them are used to be, but no longer for several years. For example, there is a policy directorate, just was mentioned, and there is a joint operational command, and there are like certain functions and certain activities which been mentioned in the article as non-existent, and so on. So yes, we are opening we opened a whole line of, because that article created lots of harm, I have to say. Lots of analysts have read it. They called me, I had probably 15 calls on that, and saying whether this is true or not. And I said, since perhaps ministry is not doing a great job of strategic communications in the West, for some people this is the kind of a piece of information which they read when they have to decide what do they think about the reform, like right now. And so we are going line by line and going through the have to bring up the reply, but what we think is this: and when I'm saying we, I mean my team also, who is, some of them are ex-military, some of them are ex-civilians, diplomats, and so on. So obviously there is a certain interoperability is a road, and it's a road where we're somewhere on that road. And in some cases we are far from where we need to be. Some cases we're quite well. For training, for example, I think we passed quite a good way. For like certain commands or certain types of forces, we passed a good way. Some cases we are way behind. The key thing is that the capability, which I've seen in 2014 when I first time visited front lines, and I've seen as a civilian volunteer the capabilities at that time, and the capabilities which I'm hearing from our Western partners, some of them some of them still working, are like it's a night and day. It's a totally different type of armed forces. And yes, it's battle hardened, and and many people left. I agree. Though they would return in many of them if things become bad again, because many people just don't like trench warfare, and you can't blame them for that. I've seen those trenches. It is psychologically very damaging, you know, to stay there. So you can't blame people for, like, after several years saying, okay, I need to go home and have a pretty much normal life. But at the same time, lots of people stayed. For example, just recently, there was a new brigadier general who is a famous and decorated soldier who used to be in the airport and so on. Now he's running the airborne command. And the former guy who was running airborne command is now the first deputy of the Chod. And the Chod himself has been to the war, and so on and so on. So, I mean, and I met like many brigade commanders who are young guys, some of them Western trained, some of them not, who came from the war, they've seen the war firsthand, and they're currently serving, as we speak, in running the brigades. Is there like remainings of the old past? Yes. But we need to understand we're talking about 250,000 of people, and so it's a tough thing. And also, budgets are sadly, though we spend more than 3% of GDP, it's still not that much for the 250 people. Now, 1,000. Do we need 250,000? No, we don't. But it's very difficult to come up with the reduction these days, which eventually it will happen. So the thing is that yes, there are issues, like significant issues, and some reforms are staggering. So sorry, some reforms are stalled. Like we can talk about the whole day about like where the procurement reform should be and why it's not there. And though we passed the law exactly a year ago, the president has signed it, and we're still like walking on circles, you know. And there are examples like that. But at the same time, specifically on the military side, you know, the guys who are there are just, some of them are just outstanding. Mm-hmm. And again, you know, I had some very informal conversations with the Western, since we are here in a sort of Western kind of a
Oasis
group.
Here.
Oasis, yeah, you could call it that, or enclave. You know, I don't know how to say. But anyway, English speaking. So I give an examples of the Western guys who, some of them no longer helping Ukraine. They already retired, or they're already doing something else. And so this is not just my personal opinion or the personal opinion of people. This is a certain kind of consensus which we've got. Anyway, that's I think where we are.
A lot there. And I want to say that we pooled our collective influence, the Kyiv Post and NATO, and we invited the Ministry of Defense, some of the speakers who are, this is their area, were out of the country, others didn't come. We also asked the Security Service of Ukraine, which is the SBU, the Soviet successor of the KGB, did not come. But we have, and this would be, I want to get back to some of Andrei's points, but I want to introduce, because we're 30 minutes into our talk, NATO-Ukraine, The Way Forward, Kurt Volker, Glenn Grant, Andrei Zagorodnik, Benita Klein. Now we turn it over to Elena Halushka, head of the International Department of the very important Anti-Corruption Action Center in Kyiv. Recently, Elena co-authored a piece with the headline that pretty much says it all: what NATO needs to do to push reforms in Ukraine. And so I'll just ask it there. What reforms are you talking about, and what does NATO need to do? Elena, the floor is yours. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you to Kyiv Post and to NATO Information Center for holding this important debate. Let me bring a little bit of activist perspective into this debate. About the anti-corruption and rule of law reforms. Well, we often hear that the comments on Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations, that Ukraine has to fight corruption first and then talk about NATO. However, we see the lack of clarity with regards to what is the scope of the reforms which is necessary to be done. Obviously, Ukraine has issues with corruption, and I wouldn't be an anti-corruption activist if I wouldn't say this. Just yesterday, judicial mafia once again stalled the long-awaited cleansing of the judicial governance bodies. High Council of Justice, which is the crown of corruption inside the judiciary. Effective institutions like National Anti-Corruption Bureau or National Bank of Ukraine are regularly under attacks. However, let's make one step back and take a look at Ukraine's transformation starting from 2008. Ukraine changed dramatically. I mean, Ukraine built from scratch the system of independent anti-corruption institutions capable of bringing evidence-based charges against high-profile, really high-profile officials. And right now we already have the first judges, prosecutors, heads of state-owned enterprises, those who were previously untouchables, sitting behind bars, convicted of their corruption-related crimes. Ukraine opened up tremendous scope of state-run information, like the company register, real estate registry, land cadastre, vehicles registers, etc. Let alone electronic asset declaration, which is something we have to be proud of. And I can go on and on and on. But the key issue is, how did we manage to get that far with the reforms that were very unpopular among the political elites? And the answer is international conditionalities, and specifically the EU Visa Liberalization Action Plan. This plan included, it was based on 3 pillars, and that is why it was very effective. It included a strong incentive, the prospect of getting the visa waivers, which was pretty much understood by the Ukrainian society. It gave a very limited and clear list of reforms and provided for a regular public monitoring about how these reforms are being implemented. Altogether, this gave Ukrainian society, and specifically us anti-corruption activists, a very strong leverage to make Ukrainian political elites adopt these reforms that were bringing Ukraine closer to the well-desired EU visa waiver. Now the question is how to sustain these reforms, achievements, and move forward with further home task. We, as local reformers who are working on the ground, see very huge potential of NATO in driving the reforms forward. Because so far, the support of NATO among Ukrainians is 54%. That's probably the record high support after the renewal of the independence. And despite the different stances of NATO allies regarding what should be the terms and time frame for Ukraine's NATO accession, there is a clear consensus among everybody that Ukraine needs to reform itself, and specifically with the areas of democracy, rule of law, and political reforms. Obviously, Membership Action Plan would be a very good and helpful tool to serve this goal, but since not all NATO allies are ready to provide us with such an instrument, and that's what the previous speakers have already discussed, we need to think about another solution which could break the vicious circle in which Ukraine-NATO political relations stuck. And therefore we, together with other civil society organizations, came up with the idea to have something intermediary, something crafted similarly to upon the model of the EU Visa Liberalization Action Plan. We call it NATO Compatibility Plan or NATO Reforms Roadmap. This should be a very ambitious, a very clear, prioritized list of the reforms, those that meet strong resistance among Ukrainian political elites and which fall under the criteria of democracy and rule of law reforms, such as, for example, the real judicial reform, the real SBU reform, sustainability of the anti-corruption institutions. Such a plan would not contain NATO commitments to any clear timeline parameters with regards to when NATO will have to move to the next integration phase, but its implementation should prepare Ukraine to join NATO when the window of opportunities will open in the capitals of NATO member states and in Ukraine. By the way, EU Visa Liberalization Action Plan, which I referred to, initially didn't have any kind of clear commitments to give Ukraine visa waiver automatically. The only commitment was to consider granting visa waiver when Ukraine fulfills all the criteria. NATO is already doing a lot to move the reforms forward. For example, Ukraine has already implemented 90% of NATO standards. That's the similar level to some NATO allies, according to the research conducted by the New Europe Center. Or just take the SBU reform. I mean, when NATO and other international partners started its advocacy back in 2016, the prospects seemed extremely gloomy. And I remember the discussions about this reform back in 2017 and 2018. There were no prospects, frankly speaking. And right now we are just a few steps away from the adoption of the SBU draft law. The civil society still has the reservations with regards to the effective and not declarative deprival of the SBU of the investigative powers, which we sent to the parliamentary committee and also shared with our international partners, because we think that this is a unique momentum which we have to seize. Because if the half reform of the SBU is adopted now, the next window of opportunities might open in the next years to come. Or let's take defense procurements. Mr. Zahorodnyuk has already mentioned it. The good law was adopted, but unfortunately it's stuck on the level of the implementation, adoption of the bylaws and creation of the registries of the defense contractors. Preparation of the state secrecy draft law stuck in the RADA working group. The establishment of the Civic Oversight Committee is foreseen already by the legislation, but it is not properly implemented. So if we talk about the Euro-Atlantic reforms, they are moving forward, but they need constant monitoring and constant push for them to be irreversible and for them to be made properly. That is why we think that if these reforms were linked to something like this NATO reforms roadmap, that would help us reformers on the ground to get a very strong leverage to push for this reform. We know that this instrument is innovative. It is not foreseen by current operations of NATO, but we also think that we should be thinking outside the box, because Ukrainians already made their choice with regards to what is our future. And Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic perspectives are incorporated in Ukraine's constitution. And if we see that some capitals are hesitant, we have to look for the solutions how to break this hesitancy, because Ukraine is doing tremendous work reforming domestically with the ongoing Russian aggression, and not only military aggression on the front line, but also hybrid aggression, disinformation, the attempts to delegitimize the reforms, the attempts to delegitimize the reformers, attacking the institutions from the inside, and
attacking the idea of Ukraine as a nation.
Well, needless, yes, to remind this. So I mean the environment in which we are reforming Ukraine is incredibly complicated, and we have to recognize the huge progress that has been made. Today, Ukraine is fighting two strong enemies, Kremlin and oligarchs. They are natural allies in making Ukraine fail. They are interested in preventing Ukraine's move towards NATO, though it is really irreversible. So what we as activists are asking is to help us make the necessary reforms faster and better.
I should probably not put Benita on the spot, but what you want is NATO in Brussels to prioritize 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
yes,
and put conditions on it to get a reforms roadmap.
Yes.
We have a membership year annual plan. Annual NATO-Ukraine NATO plan. What's the difference of this your proposed document with the plan which we already have?
And the problem of the annual national programs is that the document is super long. It's like more than 100 pages. It lacks priorities, clear priorities, and that's the biggest problem, because it covers literally all of the sectors, and all priorities means no priorities, unfortunately, and it lacks public monitoring. We know that NATO is doing monitoring regularly.
Yeah.
every year, but the results are not publicly available and therefore cannot be used by the activists as the leverage to to speed up the reforms in the areas which are considered by NATO and NATO allies as not sufficiently reformed enough. And the annual national programs lack, as I mentioned, the clear incentive. Because for this plan, we still hope that when it will be fully implemented, then the NATO allies should consider transforming Ukraine to the next phase of integration.
Well, I mean, you don't think that it's maybe easier to sort of set priorities in the current program and make it kind of a more readable and install the monitoring sort of function rather than innovate a new and convince NATO that there's a new document needed?
It could be an option. So
Yeah.
I mean, what we are
Could be simpler.
I mean, we are not advocating. We are not seeing this plan as an absolutely separate document. It might be the priority of the annual national programs, but this cannot be the priority set by Ukraine. So this should be the priorities set up jointly. Because again, if we talk about the EU visa liberalization plan, it helped to establish National Anti-Corruption Bureau, Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, e-declarations system. And I remember that the biggest fight was actually about opening up asset declarations of public officials. So they tried to prevent this hard. And if the EU visa liberalization plan was drafted by the Ukrainian side alone, it wouldn't contain these unpopular among the political among the political elite steps.
With military side, it's much easier because most of military, especially progressive ones, they understand that NATO interoperability is not just about getting to NATO; it's about actually becoming a better military, and they realize that, and they don't need to be convinced, sort of, in order to implement things. So we have a plan which you mentioned, which you just mentioned, but for the defense management, it's called SDB, Strategic Defense Bulletin. It was developed jointly. There are 5 priorities, and then it's broken down to some other priorities. There's a new version coming out very soon. It was done in 2016, and it was done jointly with NATO advisors. So it could be again criticized. It's not a perfect document, but at least it was there, and it set up a milestones at which the changes have to happen. Not that it was delivered 100% again, but at least there was a roadmap. So maybe you could take also not just a visa liberalization plan, but also SDB as an example for like a higher sort of level stuff.
I want to bring in our remote speakers, our foreigners. Kurt, you know the inside of NATO. Does this make sense? Is there some steps you would like to see for external push, conditionality, and then if you do this, we're going to get a prize, a concrete prize. Is that what's missing?
I want to echo a little bit what was just said here in the dialogue. NATO makes decisions again by consensus. It has an existing framework. So if you want to change it and do something new, you're having to get everybody else on board in order to change it. Not impossible, and the less politically significant and more technocratic, the easier it is. But that being said, I think that the point of using what's there, but within that, maybe sharpening up the prioritization to have NATO identifying these are the things that we think are really needed, and you need to focus on these first. I think that can be done at a staff level rather than going to the member states. And I think that would be very useful for Ukraine to get a little bit more oomph from NATO. In terms of the flip side of that, getting a prize, as you put it, I don't think you can ever get NATO to pre-commit to anything. That ultimately you're talking about political will and political decision making. So no one's going to say, if you do X, we will do Y. But it'll be implied by being willing to set priorities, say, these are the things we care about, please do these things. It will create a little bit of a political dynamic where there should be some expectation from NATO on its own side that, okay, we need to be doing something more. Right now, I don't think most NATO members are thinking that way. I think they just want to put it all into Ukraine and then sit back and wait. But I think creating some priorities, Ukraine meeting them, and demonstrating progress can at least improve a political dynamic.
Okay, thanks, Kurt. Glenn, stronger NATO hand in Ukraine will play into Vladimir Putin's thesis that the entire country is under external control. What would your prescription be for NATO and Ukraine moving closer, as they've outlined that they will do by 2030? And secondly, I mean, I need to give you opportunity to respond to Andrei, because I know you guys have disagreements. So take it away, Glenn.
Well, let me start with the first bit, reverse it to Andrew. I don't disagree with, because I go back to what I said at the beginning. There are differences in language and differences in perception. What I think is important, I wrote this primarily for civil society to understand that the management of defense was broken. And I checked everything. I checked it, double checked, treble checked with serving military and with civilians to make sure that I was actually writing as correctly as I could be. Now, interpretation is one thing, but if Andrew is going to rebut that, that's a good thing. In fact, I'd be really pleased to read what he writes, and I'd be really pleased that they check it, because civil society has been too quiet and too allowing of the defense military system to actually to do things badly. And I will say, right, in congratulations for Andrew, when he was in there, he tried to start sorting the Ministry of Defence out. But of course, that didn't last long. So hopefully something solid will come out of it. And where they can't argue against me, that we say this needs reform. And where they do argue against me, okay, I'll bow down. If he's got better information than me, then he's got better information than me. On the NATO part, I think I would say three things. The first thing is I'm sad that we haven't had the membership action plan, because that really is a good way of actually getting in close. Because the discussions that come around that plan do force a country to answer the questions, and the questions I've found have been much harder in the membership action plans. And by the way, I've done 3 with 3 different countries. And actually wrote the first one for Estonia the first year. So I'm quite happy with membership action plans. So it would be sad if you have to use the annual national plan, then it is too broad and it is too unfocused in terms of the defence system for that, and it could do with tightening. And I don't think it's a bad thing if Andrew and the parts of civil society get together and try and tighten that part themselves and put that to government, that these are what we think the priorities are. I don't think it necessarily has to go to NATO. But I come back to what I said at the beginning. This is a political problem, and NATO has to address the political problem to the top and explain better. I'm not sure how you do that, but it can't be in diplomatic language, because the language has to be clear and plain and precise about what it is we want, what it is we need if you want to join the club. And I think also that in general, when people come here from NATO to work, and I'm not talking about soldiers teaching tactics, but I mean in general in the NATO system, that there needs to be some pre-briefing and pre-education before they come, because there is nothing worse than coming in and saying everything's going well. And then people sit back and say, good, everything is going well. We've got 90% NATO standards or something like this, and believing it. So the NATO has to actually understand that this is an operation. If I said that to you, Kurt, needs to be an operation from NATO into Ukraine, not the same as other activities with other countries in peacetime. It can't be the same as Kosovo. It can't be the same as Bulgaria, because it's not the same. It's much more complex, much more difficult, and it needs much more preparation thinking and argument and understanding before approaching the beast to actually to work with it. And if you just think that Andrew is an example of things, you are wrong, because Andrew stands out above the others. The people you've got here stand out. They're not necessarily the people making the decisions.
Okay. Glenn,
Can I bring NATO's
you may
voice in?
jump in,
Okay,
please.
thank you.
I think it's the
So,
time.
First of all, June this year, NATO summit in Brussels. So heads of allied countries, heads of government and state made it very clear how much Ukraine matters for your Atlantic security, and how much Ukraine's resilience and the sovereignty and territorial integrity matter for Euro-Atlantic security. It's one thing. Then we also heard different opinions regarding the annual national program. So I would like to say, and it's also what my colleagues back at NATO HQ says, so that when we compare the annual national program, how it is now, how it works, how it's being used as an instrument, and it's a very valuable instrument which is being applied. So compared to several years ago, we see a huge difference. It's more focused, it's more goal-oriented, it's more substantial. So, and I did indeed want to commend, Ukraine on how Ukraine is using annual national programs. So, and also later this year, also in fall, an assessment team of the annual national program will come to Ukraine and to do it together. And also last year, for example, we invited civil society organizations to also give their assessment of the implementation of the ANP. So I think another thing, NATO has stepped up its political and practical support for Ukraine. And for example, very shortly, also already this week, we will also conduct a coherent resilience exercise in Odessa, which is during which we will test jointly with our Ukrainian colleagues and partners. We will test resilience of Ukrainian institutions, government institutions, agencies. How resilient, how they are, how they interact, and because interoperability across government, it's very important. So, and we do appreciate the progress Ukraine has done and is doing so, and it's very important. This momentum is kept, and that Ukraine indeed, takes because reforms. We speak about reforms, but it means we don't reform, we don't do reforms just for the sake of reforms. So we do it for the sake of the Ukrainian people and their futures. So, and the Ukrainian people have made very clear, what is their goal. So, and it's also enshrined in Ukraine's constitution. So, and if we do it like with a clear goal and with strategic patience, so the result will be achieved.
The result will be achieved. That's good news. I mean, on the bad side, there's so many. Well, I don't know if the bad side, complicated side. There are so many reforms, but the upside is all those, regardless of NATO, all those reforms, judicial reform, the rule of law, transparency in public spending, are necessary for Ukraine on their own. While I have you here, I mean, one of the issues is transparency in public spending, which Ukraine has had a problem with in the past and still has a problem with. Mm-hmm. You talk about the big construction program with no bids and so forth. What did you learn from your time inside the defense ministry, and what have you learned since in terms of, I mean, the public wants to know if their money is getting well spent, and given state security requirements, it's not always easy to ascertain.
Well, in defense, it's slightly better maybe in some other industries, because the defense always been a focus for many NGOs, many many volunteers, many sort of groups and activists and so on in some areas. The most problematic area in defense, it was obviously the weapons procurement and weapons and military equipment procurement, because it was going through a so-called defense procurement order, which was 100% top secret. So it's the highest level of classification, like 100%, all the document is top secret. The problem is, when we've been to a ministry, is that it's difficult even to respond to the claims about that, because you cannot comment it even on this. You cannot even disclose parts of it. So it's tough to do any proper public debate, because you literally cannot breach the law. So when we initiated this law on public procurement, we were saying, like, guys, one of the most important things is to remove that 100% classification. Certain parts of it could be, like technical parameters of some equipment could be classified, or number, or I don't know, something, you know, else. But definitely the most of the document, and at least like where you can see what's being bought for, like why you should make classified, like construction cranes, for example, or simple equipment which then brought to the units, and people will applaud and say, okay, we received that many armored vehicles, you know. So the open source intelligence will tell you exactly how many armored vehicles they received, because it's reported in every unit, like you know, that arrival of a new stuff. So anyway, sometimes it doesn't make sense. And the general rule of classification is that you don't classify what you cannot keep secret for all period of time. And you cannot keep secret most of these issues. They're coming up anyway later. So one of those is that excessive secrecy makes no sense whatsoever. But that's when we're talking about the equipment. Everything else in MOD is open in terms of the procurement. So the half of the budget goes through the Prozora, or at least it's open. It's not classified. Now the other problem which we had normally, it was the defense industry. Defense industry, specifically Ukroboronprom, it was the most secretive organization. When, you know, during years and years, you know, it was like a kingdom where you don't ask questions because nobody will answer. Everything was classified in Ukroboronprom. So, I mean, it was crazy. It was no sense whatsoever. Now the guys are opening it up. And I have to remind that also half of the equipment budget now doesn't go to the Ukroboronprom, it goes to the private contractors, which are just like private manufacturers who are like just regular guys who started to make military equipment. So things again are moving. There is a massive movement right now on reforming Ukroboronprom itself, to make it transparent, you know, to make it like this corporate governance system, and so on and so on. There's obviously lots of resistance, and it's natural, because a whole generation of business people and a whole generation of experts grew up in that sort of isolated, very elitist sort of kind of ecosystem of defense industry. It operated different terminologies in normal procurement, like on any other organizations. It had their own rules, they had their own laws, they had their own everything. So essentially, one of the problems with reforms of procurement is that people from that industry, they often don't know how the normal procurement works. They've never been there. They've never been in a procurement of Western sort of style. So it's actually really tough for them to understand what's the problem. The system worked, you know, vehicles arrived. Why are you complaining? And when people complaining, saying that, well, the whole system is artificial, it has nothing to do with NATO, all terminology coming back from the old days, and it has to go. So that new law basically removes all that stuff, and obviously makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And so, yeah, that's the, and it's not always that they are corrupt, is that very often they don't share with you the ideas that, like, how we should replace the old system with the new one. And the new one is built purely on the standard open procurement, like in any other government institution, actually even in Ukraine. Like, for example, like many government procurement is already transparent here. It's actually much more transparent than in many Western countries, I have to say, in many cases. And so the civil society always been very pushy on the military, because they spend a lot of money. You know, it's a huge part of budget. There's lots of mobilized people. There are lots of civilians who died in the war. There's lots of volunteers who joined armed forces. Lots of volunteers who joined, like, helping. So people understand that there's a vested interest in the military system. They're not going to settle with things just somehow being, you know, like pushed aside. So I think it's inevitable that it will be open. I think it's inevitable that we'll get there. Regarding civilian, yeah, part of this is a civilian controlled reform. Right now, actually tomorrow morning, there would be one of the final sort of meetings of this working group on civilian reform. Right now, there is a huge movement in Parliament to change the law on national security, to install more on the civilian control. And I do agree, majority of people on the streets, they don't understand why minister has to be civilian, why deputy ministers has to be civilian, why directors of departments have to be civilian. But so is the case in most of the Western countries as well. Civilian control is not very logical construct. It's tough to explain it to people, and you know, many people think, well, if it's about a war, probably military should run that. Not understanding that military is a hierarchical pyramid, very far from democratic setup. So it has to have the democratic kind of a sort of oversight on it on many different levels. Anyway, so that whole thing is, yes, it took time. It's a third attempt, by the way. First one was in the law on national security, 2018. We kind of moved a little bit, but well, quite a bit actually, but not there yet. Then we tried to do into 2019 in the beginning, didn't work out. Wasn't sort of ready, and it was kind of turned away. And finally, this is the third attempt, which I believe if we do, we'll get a more or less a system of civilian control similar, at least in the law, similar to Western nations, you know, which we're looking at. So
I just want to follow up. I mean, historically, I mean, the more public spending creates opportunities for black holes and corruption, obviously. And even recently, we had a corruption scandal involving a defense ministry official in Odessa. Yeah. Kicked $1 million bribe to award a contract for soldiers' housing, etc. When you were there, did you get a sense that these kinds of things were anomalies? Let me put it more directly. I mean, did you get a sense that it's 5% of GDP now, I think, more than 12 billion.
All security and defense.
Right.
So defense itself is above 3.
Did you get 3 answers? Did you get a sense that it was well spent, not well spent, or you just didn't know?
Okay, so both actually. So certain things were well spent, because there is a more or less clear movement from the planning to actually budgeting. Mm-hmm. The problem is that there is no connection, and that's another kind of a whole other discussion, that there is no connection between the strategy and the budgeting yet. It's kind of underway right now, but it's not there yet. So essentially, if there is a strategy, like we'll need to reform like our Navy this way, you know, and you see sometimes there's no clear connection, like when they bring a Navy budget. Well, actually, there is no Navy budget. There is a budget of armed forces, but it's not broken to forces yet. So when they bring a budget which goes to Navy, it's not necessarily, there's no clear link to the strategy. So when you say well spent, it's not just about the corruption, it's about how efficient every hryvnia is, because, you know, there's not that many. So yeah, there are challenges there, but it's not that hopeless as you know, as you may think. But there are definitely challenges there. Now, concerning the corruption, is there corruption in the armed forces? Absolutely. We heard like calls from sort of regular military. We kind of encourage the calls, because sometimes you don't know where things happen. So we receive lots of emails, texts, and so on from the regular military guys. We set up a new anti-corruption kind of a group there, and those guys received like lots, like on fuel, for example, on some other things, and so on. To say that this is like pandemic and it's just killing the army, I wouldn't say so. I think it's there. It's a substantial, but as you could see, there are criminal cases sort of started every once in a while.
Started, but we don't see much.
Well, but that's another story, because as soon as it's a criminal case starts, it gets to the other agencies. Sadly, not in MOD's preview at all, and then MOD can't do much about that at all, unfortunately, because even military prosecution is not MOD; it's in the General Prosecutor's Office. Yes, but they at least we're there. So again, I'm not trying to be complacent. You know, it's not the place to be complacent at all, and it's obviously there are issues, but sometimes people, and I'm not referring right now to Glenn's article anymore. Glenn I'm just saying that sometimes people are saying that it's just everything is stolen or everything is like spent like totally wrong and so on. Definitely not the case.
There's patriotism involved.
Well, absolutely,
in
and
how
there's
we
just
spend.
a common sense.
Right.
And there's just a common sense.
Okay. Elena, I was struck a couple things. You're very optimistic for the head of the International Department of the Anti-Corruption Action Center. A couple things. You thought SBU reform is in the final steps. Those last final steps can be very difficult for Ukraine. I consider myself a skeptic that the SBU is going to give up some of these enormous powers to corporate raid, shake down people, their law enforcement capabilities. But you think I could be proven wrong on that?
Well, yes, I think that the process of doing SBU reform is on its final stage, but I'm not that optimistic about the outcome of this process, unfortunately. And here I would like to comment on what Mr. Zahorodnyuk mentioned, that which bodies and which institutions are investigating corruption. Because we know that all high-profile officials fall under the jurisdiction of National Anti-Corruption Bureau and Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. But until the security service will keep their pre-trial investigative powers, and frankly speaking, even if the number of the crimes which they are tend to investigate are significantly limited, if they still have people who do with their hands and their legs pre-trial investigations, they will keep intervening in the investigations of other institutions. They will still have the tool of pressing businesses and keeping all these malpractices which we are criticizing them for. And here I would like to recall the criminal proceeding against the deputy head of the President's office, Oleg Tatarov, which was investigated by NABU and SAPO, but then upon the decision of the ordinary, not anti-corruption court, with the follow-up decision of the prosecutors general, it was transferred to the SBU and it was successfully dumped there. So right now we do not have this investigation perspective enough to get justice there. And that is why we are quite critical with regards to the SBU reform, because we think that this momentum which was generated for which has been generated for 5 years, we won't be able to repeat anytime soon. That is why if we have this window of opportunities, and I do think that we have this window of opportunities because the president committed to do the SBU reform. Secretary Stoltenberg made it a top priority. It was even the part of the memorandum signed by President Biden and President Zelensky, meaning that the reform is already, the process went that far that it simply cannot be stopped. So it will be adopted, whether it will be adopted in a good shape or in a...
And then we have the whole implementation question.
Yes, and then we have the whole implementation, yes. The problem which we see with the SBU reform today is that on one hand, it will significantly be strengthened with regard to counterintelligence, which is an important thing. But simultaneously, these counterintelligence changes, they will be introduced right away, while the SBU will be stripped of the investigative powers gradually. So by next year, the amount of the crimes they will continue investigating will downsize, but they will still keep looking into state treason, financing of the terrorism, etc. And just to recall that some civil society organizations were persecuted by the SBU a few years ago, specifically upon the charges of financing state terrorism. So this is still, you know, the loophole, which from our perspective could be misused. But the biggest problem with stripping SBU of investigative powers is that the SBU law alone is not governing investigations. meaning that we will have something which we had with the national security law. When the national security law mentioned a very clear and exhaustive list of powers of the SBU without fighting against corruption, without fighting against economic crimes, but because the other legislation, which SBU considers as the more priority legislation, was not amended. So they were governed by that legislation. And even if we do change the SBU reform and do not change criminal procedure code, they will keep doing pre-trial investigations. That is why for us it is critically important that the SBU reform has effective deprival of the functions, investigative functions, which will take place only in case if we have changes into the SBU law and criminal procedure code.
Well,
has to be done simultaneously.
We got to watch that closely. Hopefully Ivan Bakanov, the head of the SBU, is watching today.
Hopefully.
The other thing that struck me is because when people ask me, name the highest level person, highest, most severe crime for which there's been a conviction of corruption or violence in Ukraine, I draw a blank. You say you have names. So.
Yes. So far we have only 14 officials that are sitting behind bars. It may seem that this is not much. Of course, obviously, we all wanted that figure to be much higher. But just to remind everybody that the High Anti-Corruption Court, the last link in the chain of anti-corruption institutions, became fully operational only 2 years ago. Meaning that that since 2015 and 2019, before the operationalization of the anti-corruption court, all the high-profile cases were going through the ordinary courts, and they were stalled there. They were dumped there. There were even acquittals there, you know, which the anti-corruption court cannot overcome right now because we have the verdicts in these cases, meaning that. We have to take this into account and see that the pace of issuing verdicts doubled during the second year of work of the anti-corruption court comparing to the first one. The highest profile officials that are right now convicted are heads of the state-owned enterprises. They are energy-related people who were ruling thermal power plants. I do not remember which oblast specifically, but heads of state-owned enterprises. And both of them are convicted for the embezzlement schemes of around $500,000. So this is not, you know, a small scheme. That's $500,000 scheme.
Okay, we're moving.
Yeah, that's one thing. And the second thing also, please keep in mind that real big fish, people were engaged in very complicated schemes, usually with the engagement of the foreign companies that require a lot of mutual cooperation between Ukrainian law enforcement, Ukrainian courts, with their counterparts abroad. And if we talk about Cyprus companies, for example, you can imagine what is the level of cooperation between Ukrainian law enforcement and their law enforcement, for example. That's one thing. And the second thing, they do not save on lawyers. And obviously, if they have the huge teams of lawyers who know a lot of tactics, how to stall the process,
they can grind it to a halt.
Well, at least they can significantly, you know, postpone the consideration. So we still have to keep these things in mind. But overall, let's see how the anti-corruption court shows the results during their third year of work.
A lot of issues to watch there. We're down to the last 10 minutes. It's been a great discussion. So I want to give everybody their final comments. I will ask a question. If you don't like the question, Kurt, you can, and Glenn, you can answer or make your final comments however you want. But from all the speakers here, the onus seems to be really on Ukraine because of the way NATO operates, consensus, 30 nations. Ukraine can change faster. The onus seems to be on Ukraine to prove its indisputably belongs in NATO. What single reform could it do to show that to you, Kurt Volker? We'll let you start.
Well, I think that there's so many areas that are important, and I think where people have a lack of confidence or a lack of trust is in the judiciary and the ability to see that there's a fair application of the rule of law. So I think that's probably the most significant in terms of general outside perceptions. But the other thing I would highlight that I think maybe gets more to a root cause is, I'd say it's the political economic structure of the country. You have a handful of people who control a vast amount of the country's assets and wealth. And these are integrated across industries and vertically in ways that would not be possible in the West. We all in various ways have implemented antitrust legislation to break up business empires so that no one individual or no one group controls too much. And for Ukraine, I think they need something similar like that. It shouldn't be a matter of targeting individual oligarchs per se. It should be creating a playing field based on competition, based on breaking up business empires, so that you use antitrust legislation to create a demand for the rule of law. And I think doing that, then you let the chips fall where they may. Some people might face corruption charges or other ways of prosecution for things they've done, but others would just become wealthy, successful businessmen who are effective within their zone or within their area without controlling too much. And I think that kind of antitrust approach would be really getting some of the root causes of things in Ukraine.
Thanks, Kurt. Glenn, what can you think of that would provide the wow factor for those watching Ukraine and wanting to see that it's really transformed and reformed?
Put Andrew back into the Ministry of Defense.
Andrew back into the Ministry of Defense. There it goes.
Yep.
Thank you, Glenn, but probably there's something
Hard
else,
luck, mate.
hopefully.
No. Donald Rumsfeld came back twice. Defense Secretary. Go ahead, Glenn.
No, I mean, I think it's, I think he needs the chance to go back in and finish what he started. And it would have an effect because people would then know that the country is actually, okay, we've gone down the wrong road. We're now going to go back and have civil control properly. And I'm sure it would have a political effect in and around NATO that will be out of proportion almost to anything else. I can't think of any other single thing that would shake them up as much as that.
Okay. Reinstate the reformers.
Yeah.
Okay, across the board. I think the public would agree with that. There have been recent shakeups, and maybe Andrei can analyze that, but I wanted to give Andrei the same question.
Right.
What would really show that Ukraine belongs in this club?
I wouldn't say that there's one single thing, but I would say that maybe a few. So we need to do the civilian control law, clearly, because when there is no civilian control is the most important principle for NATO. If there is no civilian control in the country, if a military is uncontrolled, there's no NATO. So that has to take place properly, which is upcoming, hopefully. And then we need to complete that transition of the defense procurement. We need to do with SBU, as was absolutely rightfully said. And we do need to reform something big like a defense industrial complex, which is obviously is just starting that journey. So with those things, we will send a huge signal to the world. And they would see that the things are actually happening. That's what I would say just on top of my head. Using this opportunity, Glenn, thank you for your professional reaction on our on a sort of reaction on the article. We promise to be a very respectful and down to the kind of a point, because we used to work together a lot. So obviously, huge respect to the work been done. But I believe that military is getting there. That's what I do believe.
I agree, Andrew. I agree with you completely. But it was if you look at my article again, you'll see most of it is defence management.
That's the one.
It's not.
I'm keeping
Yeah.
it with me pretty much.
Yours is gonna be just
That's-
as long.
that's the one.
Okay.
Yeah.
In 90 minutes, we've achieved it. We've got agreement with these guys. Elena, final. What's the one thing, if there is a one thing?
No, I cannot say one thing. I'll still stick to two things. First one, obviously, SBU reform. How to turn this institution into a NATO-style counterintelligence body, fully deprived of all pre-trial investigations and other activities which are not its core functions. And the second, I would agree with Mr. Walker about the judicial reform, but I will elaborate a little bit that this should be the reform of judicial governance bodies, because it's about who are the judges for judges. We tried to have the reform with the Supreme Court. Eventually, it didn't work well. We drew the lessons from it, and we realized that it's important to ensure that in this judicial governance body, only best people with the brilliant reputation who are really ready to clean up the judiciary, only in that case we would make sure that Ukrainian justice system is cleaned and new people, credible, trusted, are invited to come. Otherwise, unfortunately, it won't work. If you start reforming some particular types of courts, then you are seeing the problems which pop up from other type of courts. So only from the top down, which is starting from judicial governance bodies, and this reform is also undergoing now, though blocked by the judicial clans, but still we hope that President Zelensky will push to unblock it.
He says he's going to meet
on Thursday.
Thursday.
We anticipate what will be the outcome of that meeting, because it's very important that Judicial Council simply implements the law. If Ukrainian judges cannot implement the law, then it's the verdict for the whole system. So we have to push hard, and I am more or less optimistic about the judicial reform. We just need to pull all the efforts of the civil society, reformers in the government, and Ukrainian international partners to get this reform finally done.
Let's hope that's it's been the winning formula in a lot of areas. Benita, you are represent the agency that brought this together. Thank you so much for your involvement in Ukraine and NATO's involvement in Ukraine. I think we brought a lot of light, some heat, which is good, but a lot of light to the issue. I give you the right of final comment.
I'll be short. In a nutshell, systemic and sustainable reform requires strategic patience and systemic work.
Okay. With that, let's close. We have a great panel here. I want to really thank Kurt Volker, Glenn Grant, Andreas Zagorodnik, Elena Halushka, Benita Klein. Thank you for your input. I hope you learned a lot. We'll see you at the next seminar. This is Brian Bonner, Chief Editor of the Kyiv Post, saying goodbye for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, goodbye. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you, people.
All right, see you next time, guys.
Yeah.